welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini-episode where I will hone in on some of the finer points from last week's main episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll continue our discussion on the 2015 Danish film entitled April 9th. The film centers on the actions of a Danish bicycle reconnaissance unit stationed on the German-Danish border just before and during the German invasion of 1940. We follow the unit as they prepare for a possible invasion and watch as they meet the Germans and do their utmost to stop the inevitable wave of invaders. April 9th stars Pilu Asbæk as Second Lieutenant Sand, Lars Mikkelsen as Lieutenant Colonel Hintz, Gustav Giza as Anderson, Elliot Hove as Lassen, and many more. The film was directed by Ron Ezra, produced by Ezra and Thomas Rador, and written by Tobias Lindholm. The film received mixed but generally favorable reviews. Blitzkrieg. The word conjures up images in our minds that generally contain German Mark III tanks crashing through bloom-filled trees on the borders of Belgium, France, Holland, Hitler in Paris, Dunkirk, the surrender at Compiègne, and German soldiers staring menacingly across the English Channel at their next target of conquest, that of course being England. There are a great many images and personalities that pour through the early war history, but one personality sticks up above most when it comes to the campaign in the West. We'll talk about him in just a few. But first, on to the Blitzkrieg. Our film focuses on a small, lesser-known portion of the so-called German Blitzkrieg in the West in 1940. I say so-called because Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, is a term that was made up by the press. Germans never used the term in any official military fashion. It would have been a hashtag of its day, if you will, meaningless to its supposed originator, and forgotten overnight. However, Blitzkrieg is a term that has clung on. It's still vivid in our thinking when we think of that summer of 1940, when the free European world, at least everything outside of the UK, evaporated. The whole point of a Blitzkrieg-style attack is to smash through an enemy's front with a massive thrust of combined armor, air support, and infantry. The attacking units are then to encircle and cut off the enemy with the fast-moving armor, while the infantry wears them down, supported by unceasing air power and artillery. Combined arms. The tactic was born out of the trenches of World War I, where the meat grinder of 1914 and 1918 was just too much for Germany to bear again. The architect of the tactic, or at least the main proponent of its use, was a German general who would become a legend, General Heinz Guderian. The great general is quoted as having said, and I quote, "Whenever in future wars the battle is fought, armored troops will play the decisive role," unquote. And they certainly did in the Blitzkrieg of 1940, and if you will, the Blitzkrieg in the Soviet Union in 41. Quick, decisive thrusts meant to knock an enemy unconscious in order to confuse and force him to surrender or simply annihilate him, would be the tactic of choice for the summer of 1940. A German attack on the Western powers was not a surprise to anyone. Pretty much everyone knew that it was coming sooner or later. It was just a matter of when and where from. The first actions of the invasion of the West occurred on April 9th. These, of course, were the invasions of Denmark, as we discussed last week in the main episode, and the invasion of Norway as well, both of which were German victories, Denmark taking 6 hours, and Norway taking longer, 6 hours to defeat a country. Norway capitulated on June 10th. As I said, the first actions were April 9th. The French and British readied themselves for the inevitable invasion that they knew was coming. That occurred on the morning of May 10th, when the Wehrmacht unleashed Fall Gelb, or Plan Yellow. The attack did not come against a prepared French Maginot Line as the Allies had expected, but a rapid advance through the Netherlands that lasted a week. Dutch forces fought valiantly and inflicted heavy casualties on the Germans, but were simply overwhelmed and surrendered following the bombing of Rotterdam. The use of combined arms by the attackers, specifically paratroops, or Fallschirmjäger as the Germans called them, to capture key bridges, airfields, and other strategic positions before the Dutch could react, doomed the defenders. After Rotterdam was bombed, as I said, the Dutch government, under threat of more bombing, simply said no more. They were done. Following the Netherlands, the German war machine blasted through Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Ardennes Forest, a location that they liked so much they used it twice, once in 1940 and again in 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. The speed at which the Germans moved cannot be understated. It was the speed and confusion caused by both retreating Allied troops and the refugees that went with them that allowed the Blitzkrieg to be as successful as it was. The speed of the maneuvers, the amount of territory that was captured, and how fast it was captured simply astonished the Allies. By May 21st, 11 days after the initial assault, the Germans had reached the English Channel. In 4 years of fighting during World War I, The Germans never could have imagined moving that fast. The incredible speed and success of the Blitzkrieg in the West can be shown in the actions of one German officer. One of the generals at the forefront of the assault on France, leading the 7th Panzer Division, was a World War I veteran like many of the German commanders, and at that time, relatively unknown. His actions in France would prime him for more success in later campaigns and would propel him to international fame and earn him the eternal respect of his adversaries, even to this very day. It was in the lush green landscape and open plains of France in 1940 that the Desert Fox was born, Erwin Rommel. Rommel had taken command of the 7th Panzer Division not long before the invasion of the Netherlands. He had essentially retrained the Green Division to be a rapid strike force, the very image of what Guderian had devised. Bursting onto the scene and reaching the Meuse River by the 3rd day of the operation, Rommel and his 7th Panzer routinely outran their own supply lines, something that his future adversary George S. Patton Jr. would do 4 years later as he dashed across France with the Third Army. Rommel was one of a new breed of leader, always at the front, literally the front lines. He would direct river crossings, oftentimes under fire, standing on the riverbank barking orders at his men to move this way and that. When his engineers would be stopped by heavy enemy fire, Rommel would bring up flak guns and tanks to lay suppressive fire across the river so that his men could proceed. In a rare instance of pause, his 7th Panzer, halted by fierce fire from an armor-supported counterattack on the Meuse, Rommel grabbed an MG-34 and personally helped defend his bridgehead, and shortly afterwards waded into the water to help his engineers lash the pontoons together so that further elements of his Schwerpunkt, or spearhead, could drive across the river and continue their thrust. Such was his tenacity and drive. While Rommel's usage of the 88mm anti-aircraft gun as an anti-tank weapon against the British Matilda tanks at Arras is the story most people have heard when it comes to the Desert Fox and the fall of France, it is not his greatest feat, at least not in my opinion. That moniker falls to his spearhead drive through a little town called Avenay. The operation, which was really a raid, earned his 7th Panzer Division the nickname La Division Fantôme, the Ghost Division. Seemingly appearing out of nowhere and from behind, the 7th would encircle and either capture or annihilate their foes as the campaign for France wound down. Avenay was near a position of the extended Maginot Line, the aforementioned impregnable line of defense that France depended on for her border security. On May 15th, Rommel, along with every other German division, had been ordered to halt progress. Rommel had penetrated deep behind enemy lines with his 7th Panzer, and he and other units were directly forbidden to attack or cross French fortifications on this extended portion of the Maginot Line. Little was known about this extension of the Maginot, and German High Command did not want the panzers to become embroiled in a drawn-out fight with fixed fortifications that may be heavily defended. This went directly against the theory of Blitzkrieg and what had worked so well for the Germans to this point. True to his personality, Rommel ignored this order. Upon receiving direction from General Hoth to proceed despite the order, Rommel pushed onwards toward the Maginot Line from behind. Rommel's forward units approached the Maginot positions around 1800 hours on the 16th of May. Darkness was beginning to enshroud the battlefield, and it would have been prudent and advisable for any German officer to wait until the following morning to launch a prepared attack, with the combined armed support of more infantry, heavy artillery, and the Luftwaffe. Rommel, however, decided that that would not be his plan of action. He wanted surprise, and he knew that the only way to achieve that would be to attack, right now. At night, with tanks, against fixed defensive positions with little or absolutely no intelligence at all about the enemy's strength. Rommel's advanced elements smashed into the line at approximately 1830. The element of surprise had been achieved. Surprised or not, though, the French put up a vicious fight. Several panzers were knocked out, and the Germans took heavy casualties. Yet Rommel pushed on. In several places, his tanks had penetrated deep into the defensive line and knocked out several bunkers and positions. The rear areas were neutralized with nighttime artillery fire that was uncannily accurate. Engineers destroyed pillboxes and roadblocks with satchel charges, allowing Rommel, with the lead unit, to blast through the positions and race along the road behind, firing on both sides of the road as the tanks raced on, followed closely by motorcycle infantry and the recon battalions. Around 2300 hours, the 7th Panzer punched through a second line of defensive positions. By the light of a bright moon, the Germans saw open fields in front of them. They'd broken the impregnable line. Rommel himself said, and I quote, "The way to the west was now wide open. We were through the Maginot Line. 22 years before we had stood for 4.5 long years before the selfsame enemy. And now we had broken through the renowned Maginot Line and were driving deep into enemy territory. It was not just a beautiful dream. It was reality, end quote. Not content with the success, he drove on. A penetration through the defensive line would be wasted unless it was exploited. By moonlight, his tanks raced on. As he approached Avonay, his lead elements came upon the French 5th Motorized Infantry Division, along with elements of the French 18th Infantry and 1st Armored. Their vehicles and bivouacs lined neatly along the roadway that the Mark IIIs and Mark IV tanks of the 7th Panzer now roared. Firing along both sides of the road as they rolled, the tanks and accompanying infantry spread terror through the French ranks. Men awoken from their sleep by the roar of German tanks and the high-pitched crack of rifles, the thunder of artillery, and the staccato ripping of MG-34 machine guns. Never before had there been an attack such as this. The Germans literally crushed the 5th Motorized Infantry while they were asleep, shooting the French as they took cover in roadside ditches to escape the speeding German tanks. A German officer said, and I quote, "I have never seen anything like the scenes along Rommel's route of advance. His tanks ran into a French division on the same road and simply advanced right on past it. For the next 5 or 6 miles, there were hundreds of trucks, tanks, and vehicles, some driven into ditches, others burned out, many still carrying dead and injured. Frenchmen came out of the fields and woods with abject fear written on their faces and their hands in the air. From up front, Rommel, standing upright in his armored command vehicle, personally directing, his cap pushed back, smiling, urging everybody ahead," end quote. Rommel pushed on through midnight, finally reaching the hills west of Avonay, halting to regain contact with his rear units, which he had outrun. The firefight in Avonay, mopping up really, continued until 0400. Still he pushed on, forcing a crossing of the Somme River at 0600. Running low on ammunition and fuel, forced Rommel to stop. As he realized his situation, it dawned on him that his thrust had been so quick, his progress so rapid, that only his advance units had the time to follow him. He'd outran everyone in the 7th Panzer Division. The main portion of his 7th Panzer were far behind him, 50 kilometers behind him. His advance had been made with meager forces, yet achieved stunning results. Rommel's losses had been astonishingly light. Some 40 men were killed and 75 wounded. By May 17th, some 10,000 French prisoners had been taken in the 7th Panzer's area of operations, all thanks to the chaos and confusion caused by Rommel's rambunctious, breakthrough and advance. Blitzkrieg in its purest form. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Be sure to tune in next week when we discuss the 1957 epic, The Bridge on the River Kwai. Until then, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes and Stitcher if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.